I'm going to be talking to Mark Winfield, who is a professor of environmental studies at York University, about Ontario's ongoing dilemma of what it's going to do to replace the nuclear power plants that are underway, being refurbished or will be refurbished soon, and what the role that natural gas will play in that. So, welcome to the interview, Mark.
Good afternoon, Markham.
No, basically, what we're setting up here is a discussion of the independent electrical system operators' ongoing assessments of the role that natural gas will play. There's been some concerns that natural gas power generation will ramp up something like 600% by the 2030, making it impossible for Ontario to meet its climate commitments. And there are alternatives which the government appears to be ignoring. What's your take on all of this?
Well, I think we're still more or less in that situation that the ISO has done some updating of its assumptions, although not that significant. And so the basic sort of frame that we've been in for a while is still on the table. And in particular, the disconnects, particularly with the federal government as well, in terms of its desire for a net zero electricity grid by 2035, and where Ontario seems to be heading is a very, very different direction. And we've not really seen any answers from either side about how this is supposed to be reconciled.
This is something that you and I have had a couple of interviews previously about this. And the federal government is proceeding very deliberately and fairly rapidly now to implement a clean electricity standard, and that'll be national. And I don't know how Ontario gets out of it. So if Ontario runs afoul of the federal legislation, what might be the consequences? Fines? What are the options there?
At this stage, we don't know. I mean, this is the shoe on the net zero electricity system that has yet to be dropped in terms of what happens if you have a non-compliant province. There are possibilities. I mean, the card of a regulatory phase out of certain technologies has been played already around coal, or is in the process of being played. Beyond that, it's unclear. Given the federal government can put pressure on certain specific technologies, but ultimately electricity systems are under provincial jurisdiction. There's a hint or an assumption in the IESO's work that at some point the federal government would effectively take natural gas fired generation out of the output-based pricing system for industrial emitters and apply the full carbon price, but no one on the federal side has actually said that yet. But that would be a logical move in some sense. But so far, it's unclear what the consequences for Ontario will be in terms of the pathway that it's on at the moment.
Now, again, hearkening back to interviews that you and I have done, the federal government has several pieces of federal legislation that allow it to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So it could do, as you say, which is get rid of the output-based system on carbon pricing, which gives, I don't know what kind of a discount the natural gas power plants in Ontario get, but I know that it's 80 to 90% for, let's say, oil sands producers.
Well, it's essentially, yeah, it's
essentially 95%,
the same. 95% is in Ontario.
Okay, so if the full carbon price is applied, then electricity prices go up. Now, is this a case, where the Ford government says, okay, go ahead, then you take the political fallout from that move, and we'll tell ratepayers who's to blame?
That's unclear at this stage. It's not clear the Ford government has thought that far ahead yet, or if they are, they're not. They're certainly not signaling it in any way that this somehow could present a problem for them. So how it would play out in practice is an interesting question of political dynamic that would actually sort of come to a head in practice somewhere past the next federal election. But again, I don't think at this stage we've seen nothing from Ontario that suggest they're thinking that far ahead, although they are seeking to tinker with the output-based pricing system more generally to let industrial, in fact, to let more industrial emitters off the hook there. So how this federal provincial dynamic is going to play out at this stage remains unclear, because of course the federal side has also been remarkably quiet about this express train that seems to be coming down the track in Ontario. And that is particularly remarkable given that if you look at the federal government's 2030 emission reduction plan, electricity is where the biggest chunk of emission reductions are supposed to come from. And it's hard to see how that's going to work out given the pathway that Ontario was on now.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the assumptions in the IESO report and what is rumored to be in the next, coming up in the next report. And it says, and this came from the Ontario Clean Air Association folks, no analysis of the benefits and costs of banning gas-fired electricity exports to the US. Mark, I got to tell you, I had no idea that Ontario was exporting electricity to the US from those gas power plants. That seems to be low-hanging fruit.
One would think so, that would be an obvious one to take off the table, and particularly as the Lake Erie Connector project has been abandoned, which was sort of underpinning all of that. So it is surprising that even these sort of more obvious things still seem to still be on the table, and particularly given that the minister kind of went back and told the ISO to go think about this some more. And indeed, the premier during the election debates said he wanted a 100% clean system. So where the holdup seems to be is unclear at this stage. The gas exports question is one. There's other issues being raised around Quebec and around assumptions around conservation as well. Which seem to leave, continue to put Ontario into this box that it managed to construct for itself, of not seemingly have any alternatives but to run the gas plants up.
Well, let's talk about Quebec. I mean, and again, you and I have talked about this before, but Quebec has surplus power, surplus hydropower, and there just seems to be no interest in Ontario at all to importing some of that reasonably priced clean electricity.
No, indeed, this is one of the criticisms that's out there, that the ISO seems to be both overpricing what electricity from Quebec might cost, is making assumptions about limitations on export capacity and availability, assumptions about what would be involved in constructing interties, even though we've just finished a very successful intertie project. It seems that the options that one would think are should be on the table aren't getting very much thought. Now, with Quebec, there is a bit of an issue because the window may close at some point. Although at the moment, Quebec continues to have issues with trying to build additional export infrastructure. It would be a whole lot easier to build it to Ontario than to navigate the politics of Maine and Vermont and New York. But despite Mr. Legault's repeated overtures, there seems nothing but silence on the west side of the Ottawa River.
Well, another topic that's not being discussed very much is energy efficiency. And now plenty of provinces have brought this in the past. British Columbia has, through its Crown-owned utility, BC Hydro, has had this for years, and it's worked very well. It's helped to keep the load growth in British Columbia basically flat for the last decade. It's not the only reason it was flat, but it's certainly been one of the factors. And again, how is this not being considered as a major policy in Ontario?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, Ontario also had quite a successful energy efficiency strategy up until 2019 when Mr. Ford canceled it. We've had several new efficiency potential studies done for the ISO itself, sort of looking at what's technically possible, what's economically rational, and also what's actually in the energy efficiency language achievable. What do you think really could be done? And those are pointing in the direction of very, very significant resources, enough to deal with projected demand growth and then some. And yet the IESO continues to make very conservative assumptions in a sense of lowballing what the potential contributions from efficiency could be. And one is just sort of left scratching one's head, other than that, absent political direction from the province saying get serious about efficiency, they don't feel they can go there. I think that may be part of what's going on here, is that they're sort of up against constraints that are effectively politically imposed upon them, that then does not allow for the full consideration of potential range of options that might be available to the province.
Sure. We've seen that in other provinces as well. Now, Ontario was not exactly backwards in terms of, concern about climate change, the presence of environmental groups who advocate for these kinds of policies. And yet this discussion seems to be almost completely absent from public discourse. What has to happen to get the attention of the Ford government and get them to change their political stance on some of these issues?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of possibilities. I mean, there was, during the election campaign, there was actually some quite substantial coverage of this issue, but it hasn't necessarily carried over that much. It may be that the federal government is going to have to put the Ford government on the spot on this, and put it in a position where it says, well, yep, electricity prices will go up in some way if you don't come up with a better plan, and sort of force the Ford government to defend its position in favor of climate change and dirty air. Short of that, I mean, the word is out there, but it hasn't sort of had full traction. This sort of has to, I think, come to something of a head for that to really sort of find some traction and sort of start to raise questions of what is going on here, and is this really the best that we can do, given that the range of options available to the province are actually expanding. I mean, IESO itself, to the surprise of some, commissioned a study on distributed resources, and we've seen a draft, but we're waiting to see the final version, which suggests, again, thousands of megawatts of potential, economically viable, technically feasible, achievable potential. And again, we see no signals in terms of actual uptake of those options. So one sort of has to wonder, where is the Ford government paying any attention at all? Apparently not. It may need a nudge from Ottawa, and there is historical precedent for that. That is part of how the coal phase out happened in Ontario. Was in the end, the federal government, Mr. David Anderson was the federal environment minister, ultimately signed a treaty with the Americans and said, look, if you don't do something about this, I will. And it may come to that again, that Mr. Gibault may have to start asking questions more publicly about what is going on in Ontario about electricity.
Well, Mark, thank you very much. Always appreciate your insights.
Great, thank you.